like a number of different ways of. There's one presentation which is like a slightly more broad, and it talks about. I've like grouped lots of projects thematically. And it's a nice like overarching input, but you might not, it's not that detailed into each project. And then there's one that's a little bit more detailed under each specific one, but then it loses some of the kind of the thematic element of it. What would you guys prefer? First
I think the broad approach sounds quite good to me.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, whatever's easy to do.
Let it be then. Let it be. Let that be the case. And also, are you guys all from like the same department and stuff? Are you just from different, all around the University of Sheffield?
I think it's all University of it's all architecture department, I think.
Okay, cool.
As far as we're aware.
And how have things been going this term as well?
Good, yeah. I mean, probably not as good as other years, but in the circumstances, good.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, that's good. It's good to hear that, because I think it's good. It's so difficult this year. We're doing a bit of teaching ourselves this year, and I feel so sorry for the students. I think like it really is no way to live life, but needs must at the moment. So here we are.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and then I'll let me know if it's. Oh, I now have to turn my camera off. And let me know if it's all good.
Oh, are we all right to record this meeting?
Yeah, by all means. I'll try not to swear too much.
Right, over to you. Thank you very much.
Is it presenting? Is it presenting?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So, hi everyone, and thank you for having me. My name is Akil. I'm 1/3 of a collective called Resolve. We're an interdisciplinary design collective that work between the disciplines of art, architecture, engineering, and technology to address social issues. Can you see my screen when it's on full screen now like this?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic, okay. So a lot of the work we do revolves around this design philosophy, which is about using sight as a resource. And by that, we mean kind of appraising and valuing local human resources as well as local material resources. So that often ends up with a kind of upcycling type approach where we use local materials and we work with the rhythms of different sites and kind of material productions, but also like working really, really closely with tacit knowledge and local knowledges. That a lot of that approach was born from kind of the first projects that we did being in our own area, and we're having to wear these two hats as both designers and people who live there, like locals. And we've tried to kind of bring some vestige of that approach onto places that we work now, being kind of quite far from where we live, like kind of increasingly now over Europe and also the rest of the UK as well. And so I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about Chef, which we did a project on last year and we really fell in love with. And in fact, the conversation I was just having in the meeting that I was late to on the way here was I was paradoxically quite late because I went on a rant about how much I love Sheffield. So the way I want to kind of talk about the projects in general and the work in general on this is rather than a kind of chronological approach, which I think can be interesting sometimes, to give it like grouped within themes, and that way you might be able to see kind of various aspects of the projects that are drawn onto one another and how the whole thing gets mapped. And before that, to really look at what we mean when we're talking about interdisciplinarity. And this is quite an old thing that we give to interns sometimes when they're working with us, to really help position us. Because it can be quite difficult. We're not architects per se, even though we work within the field of architecture and with lots of architects. We're not artists really, although we work with lots of art institutions and lots of galleries. We're not tech guys by any stretch of imagination, but we're also within there. And also, I think our kind of more natural home, I'd say, and something I tell a lot of people is that, like, even though we work within this architecture world, and we're in the AJ and all this random stuff, like we came up around musicians and poets and zine makers, and that's for us, that's been home for a while. And so just how we navigate these worlds, I think, is a really important part of the practice and the meaning of interdisciplinarity, which I guess we can get into a little bit at the end. And so the first little group of themes and approaches I call political ecologies. With each one of these, I'm going to talk about some kind of antecedents, so talk about some broader concepts within that, then talk about some of the projects, and then afterwards I'll talk about a few other people that are doing very similar things as well, to give it a bit of a more kind of brief, a better overview. So I'm stumbling over my words today. I'll try and stick to like 15 minutes each one, so that gives us some time to like chat after. And so one of the big things that one of the big parts of our approach within this kind of political ecology type theme is scale. And this is a quote from Adrian LaHue, who now teaches, he's now the dean at the RCA. And at the time he wrote something called, in 2016, he wrote a piece called Scale of Problem, Architecture's Trap, and it was really influential to the approach. And within that piece, one of his quotes is that a small thread captures something essential in the character of the subject better than an image. And within this, he's talking about something called Virgil's traps. And it was about it's an anthropological piece about the idea or the kind of theory behind the trap. And in that, a trap needs to embody something essential about its prey. It was quite vulgar in some ways, the old anthropological writings about the traps, Virgil's traps. But it was really interesting in the sense that architecture, or something that works at this scale, needs to embody like a very particular type of a characteristic of that of which it's trying to interact with in order to do that effectively. They give this really weird and morose example of, like, to capture chimpanzee, you need to have a fifth thread that isn't too loose, but it isn't too taut. So it's not loose enough not to prompt their inquisition, but not so tight that it prompts their kind of it prompts that they kind of feel danger about it, they feel skeptical about it. You have to be somewhere in the middle. You have to be somewhere in there to just about get that and just about embody that inherent inquisitivity of a chimpanzee, and that works outside of the idea of trap. And Adrian LaHue is talking very specifically in this about the environment and nothing to do with trapping animals, of course. And he's talking about, and he looks at how different scales work in that same way, and from mathematical scales to architectural scales, looking at a metric scale and how that captures this essential characteristic of a certain system, be that a particular system, an ecological system, a human system, all these kind of things. Another one is that relates to the idea of political ecology, and this is a text that we continuously refer to, and I give to our students, and we also just like, it's like we say it every day in the office. Everyone holds hands and does the kumbaya and repeats Shannon Matten quotes. This one's about maintenance and care in the city, and I'll just read a little bit out. So she says, if we apply care as the framework of analysis and imagination for practitioners who design our material world, the policymakers who regulate it, and the citizens who participate in its democratic platforms, we might succeed in building more equitable and responsible systems. And so I think what Shannon Matten embodies in this text is really this idea of replacing these too much afforded ideas of innovation and progress, in a sense, or valuation, with these ideas of care and maintenance, which should be more central to all of our practices. One of the works cited in that, and that's then become a work that we've kind of worked closely with the theory of, is this one by Mieles Lederman Ukulele, who worked in New York in the 70s and 80s, and she became the New York Sanitation Department's first artist in residence, and her art is kind of broadly understood as maintenance art. So she worked very, very closely with the sanitation department, and all in an exercise of valuing that care work, using artistic practice and creative practice to value works of care in the city. Theaster Gates' Civil Tapestry is also another really important example when it comes to the idea of political theologies, political ecologies, and that is in a sense this idea, and I've kind of alluded to it before, with the talk of the site as a resource in both human and material resources. And this is the idea of this material ecology within a site, not just the reuse of materials because of our environmental reasons or whatever, but understanding the political histories of material, and that no material is politically avalent. All materials have this charge, this political and historical charge, and which architecture and spatial work can bring out. And this is a piece by Theaster Gates called Civil Tapestry, which he exhibited here in 2011. And it looks at the fire hydrants from the Birmingham in America, Birmingham, Alabama, the Birmingham Fire Department, alluding to an event in 1963 where there was a demonstration, a civil rights demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama, where the public officer the Officer for Public Safety at the time ordered the fire department to hose down the children and students demonstrating, kind of killing someone, causing many injuries. And so like that, these materials are politically charged and historically charged, I think, is a really important part of how we use and incorporate materials. And this is another example of the political charge of bricks from Theaster Gates as well, in how bricks were kind of maintained in segregated neighborhoods in Southside Chicago, but how the performance of that maintenance of brick also alludes to wider systems of controlled degradation and segregation in American urban life. Language and poetry and speech is something that's also really important in our practice, even if it doesn't manifest. Sorry, even if it doesn't manifest in that way. We don't go. We aren't poets, for example. But how language can be subversive is something that we like to take and interpret materially, and to use spatially. And this is a poem by Louise Bennett, who is a really famous Jamaican poet. And the program is called Colonization in Reverse, Colonizing in Reverse, which kind of really quirkily prefigures the migration of West Indian immigrants into the UK during the Windrush era as a type of reverse colonization. And so how language can be subversive and how language can flip these things on its head and kind of reappropriate oppressive systems, I think is a really important part of our practice. So to get into the actual stuff, the first project within this I'd like to show is one called Rebel Space, and this was our first project in Brixton into the London Design Festival in 2016. So for this, we created a pavilion, a temporary pavilion that stood in St Matthew's Church Gardens in Brixton, which is kind of our home turf. And it stood for 7 days and 7 nights. I don't have my watch, so I can't tell how much time I'm going through. Anyway, I'll just try and be good. So it stood for 7 days and 7 nights. And like all our spaces, this space in particular, like all our spaces, this one designed for us meant as much physically as it did programmatically. And so a large part of this design was to program a timetable, and by which the space was active every day, afternoon and evening. This also kind of catered towards a planning regulation, as an onus on planning regulations as much as it did like a kind of a reason to activate space. And so that conversation between the programmatic and the spatial, I think, is something that's always inherent in any aspect of design. And so, like I said, it had a number of different events, from like film screenings. This was some of the space when it first got erected, performances, workshops and talks. We had a different artist exhibition every morning that we then overlaid as the mornings went on. So the space kind of recorded the work that was going on in the in the pavilion. Really important community workshops and talks as well that happen in there. And working with young people being a kind of central part to our practice, we worked with 80 young people to look at how to imaginatively waterproof the pavilion, some of which we incorporated into the final projects. Visibility was a huge part of the way we worked in this, and St Matthew Church Gardens being a highly contested space on a number of different scales and levels in Brixton, being visible in that place and building visibly, using this idea of visibility as a way of engaging in people's interest, and also with opening up discussions, was a really important part of that project. And then a final kind of design thing was the idea of pivoting the pavilion so that all the walls were actually doors. That way that no one was ever kind of fully enclosed and left and kind of felt closed in, or never, and no one was ever felt kind of closed, left out. That way we kind of tried to prefigure a space as semi-permeable. We also used materials that we could only source from within a mile radius of the site. And so all the materials we used from with local areas, and that again embodies this idea of using the site as a resource. It also took into account our design constraints at the time, that we didn't have a car. So we could only walk things around with pallets. We had this little wheelie pallet that would just go on the road and piss off the drivers with. So stuff like that. The project, as many of our projects, isn't standing right now. It was temporary, and there'd be no sign of it if you were to go there now. And so continuing the legacy of some of these projects was a really important part of how we understand temporariness when working with temporary interventions. And so we try to encourage other young practices to do a very similar thing. And this was one done by a practice called 3.09, and now Migrants Hero. And we can help them set up their version of the pavilion in the years after. Passageway was another project in Brixton, which I'd like to kind of put within this political ecologies framework. And Passageway was a project where we were situated within Brixton Market, and we were really interested in this question of market value, not the value of housing and financialization of spaces, but what kind of alternative values do markets have today, our urban markets? What kind of technological value, what financial value, what social value, what environmental value, and historical political value do markets have today in our urban environments? We did a lot of archival research looking at the historic importance of Brixton, but also it's at the center for the Afro-Caribbean populations, which it still very much is today, but also kind of looking further than that as well. And we tried to work with a currency of the space. So we were within an abandoned storage unit, and we tried to use a currency that we found from the Brixton market. We call it like a spatial currency. And so kind of taking off the lenses of locals, which we had to do, and then kind of putting on these lenses of designers, or kind of at least having a conversation between those two views. What we did was end up taking an essential market infrastructure, which was these banana boxes which became everything other than banana boxes when they're being used in the markets. They became storage units, plinths, shelves, ways of kind of mitigating water damage, all sorts of things. They stored everything other than bananas in these things. And we ended up using this essential market infrastructure and tried to turn it into an internal structure. So using about 400 different banana boxes, we created this internal armature for the space itself becoming a platform for events, workshops, local artist exhibitions, and also food events as well. All celebrating and working with this idea of the production and consumption of food in our local, in our cities. And so the space changed and adapted with each kind of use, and as it lasted throughout the period of a month. One of which was counterbalancing tables that could move around with a market with food and fruit from the market. And so yeah, like I said, like different events, workshops, and talks. This is my brother and colleague Seth talking, and also lots of parties. And when I used to show this project, I used to forget how many party slides I put in, which is quite a lot. But actually, I now think that it's right that I put these in, and actually celebration and joy within space, and how we create spaces that allow us to practice joy. Is a really important part of our work. All of our projects like this have a huge and a really important party element to it. It's an important part of how people come together in spaces. The party we had in Sheffield was wild. Anyway, sorry. I can't even tell if people are laughing because I can't see. And so using these temporary spaces to create rifts within the kind of normative performance of space, I think, is a really important part of the project. This is some work we exhibited in the project in the space by an artist called Shola Olulade. And Shola Olulade was a local artist. She was from Tulse Hill, and this was one of the kind of first time that she had exhibited, especially within her kind of local area. And so providing that, not even just providing that opportunity, but sharing the opportunity that we had in order to help other creatives to do what they're doing, is a really, really important part of what it means to platform. How do you platform as a verb rather than talking about creating a platform as a noun? So creating these rifts in spaces and kind of allowing for these opportunities is a really important part of that. The project, as other temporary projects, as I said, doesn't exist anymore, and there's no trace of it. But it continued its life as a research project, and we were really interested in how these banana boxes, all of which have the names of countries from South America and Central America, quite literally construct this space of Central Afro-Caribbean identity in Brixton and in London. And it turned into a research project about that explored the movement of commerce, and fruit produce and Black bodies around the Caribbean basin in the early 20th century, and this kind of form of American colonialism through the United Fruit Company in the area as well. And so, though the project doesn't live on tangibly, I think it exists in a number of different research outputs. And most recently, we wrote a piece in the Funambulist about that kind of that system and the relationship between infrastructures and spaces that we can read through the trade of fruit. The last one in this political ecology theme is On the Corner, and this is a project that we did for Tate and with 10th Gallery in Rotterdam last year. The project was really concerned with the idea of the corner shop as a repository for cultural production. We were really interested in these combinations, or the nexus of the corner shop in London and the bodega in Rotterdam as being these kind of sites of cultural sites of cultural production, but these contested sites of cultural production. And so we wanted to use not only a material, but a typology that was familiar to us and familiar to corner shops in them, and subvert this typology and turn it into something structural. And so, you know, I think an obvious point of reference for us was the crisp boxes and how people use crisp boxes as repositories for other crisps, and that performance or that kind of ritual that shopkeepers go through in order to do that. And we tried to make that into something structural. So we ended up creating this kind of temporary structure within the 5th floor on the Tate, and also explored the kind of number of different other geometries, like the corner shop facade geometries, working with African wax fabrics, and a group called Rose de Hoya, who were doing the upholstery for that, and creating a space that was then programmed for an event between the two youth groups of the Tate and Gallery Rotterdam. So some just more bits of the thing. So an important part for us for this temporary project was also how we left a material trace, or how we left a knowledge trace, I guess, that's not a good word, within this institution, within this large institution, the Tate. And so the central structure was also in a kind of library for zines. And so, like I said, we came up around lots of different zine makers. And so what we sought to do was to try and platform and bring some of those zines and some of that work into the space as an archive and as a display as well. And so people could come and they could read these works. But what that also meant was that, and what we also stumbled across with a weird quirk by which these large institutions will buy some of the books that you specify for a kind of reading list, and outside of the budget that you're given for your production. And that way, the readings also stay in the permanent collection of the Tate. And so these readings kind of exist within the permanent collections of the Tate. And that was kind of slid in at the trace of this project in some ways. So ways in which these temporary projects also leave some lasting trace isn't just the physicality, it can also be something textual, it can also be something that exists and leaves a trace in the archives. Work that I think is really pertinent to this idea of political ecology, and expressly the built environment, is work like that of Grua. And so Grua are, so like Grua in a weird way. So Grua are like a Brazilian practice in Rio de Janeiro, and this practice, the beach and time, was a really important and a really fantastic project that looks into the temporal scales around the beach, both like kind of geological and cultural, but looking at working through these ideas of like time and these layers of performance, but through the excavation of materials. So it was really delicate and refined interventions in space to reflect this kind of thinking about how we interact with time. Another one is by Didier Corbu in a series that lasted between the 90s and early 2000s called Needs. And in the series Needs, he kind of creates these playful infills within the city, responding to these larger infrastructural degradations within the city with this kind of playful arrangement of existing stuff, of existing form. And that kind of thinking, and I think that kind of practice is really influential when it comes to thinking about how we work within wider material and political ecologies in the city. Another one by Didier Corbu as well. Actually, this one wasn't Didier Corbu. Anyway, and finally, a work by Recetas Urbanas in Sevilla, in Spain, called Skip SC, and this project can capitalize on this very quirky public policy of like the affordance of skips to local areas. You could get a skip for quite cheap. All you have to do is kind of really apply for one, but mirrored with a lack of kind of, or a lacking public space infrastructure in the city. And so it encouraged people to then go and order these skips and turn those into pieces of public space. And so that was, again, a really interesting example of how all the things that we've kind of talked about within political ecology, and how we affect scale and how we condense these much larger scales and systems into really small scale interventions. The other, the second kind of theme I'd like to talk about is separation. I'm just giving one eye to the time. And separation is something that's run through a series of our projects as well. This idea of separation, a lot of that work, or a lot of that thematic work came from thinking around borders and thinking around how we're kind of separated as sovereign entities, but also down to like more intimate separations. And a really amazing quote for me, a quite impactful one, was one by Andre Green, who was a psychoanalyst in the 90s, a French psychoanalyst in the 90s. And in this quote, he says, "You can be a citizen or you can be stateless, but it's difficult to imagine being a border." And I think for me, this really brings together that nexus of how these larger systems really interact with our bodily understanding, our experience, our kind of really visceral experience of separation. So responding to that, one of the projects I'd like to show is one called Off Grid, which is a project that we worked on in the Haus der Kultur in the Welt in Berlin in 2018, not last year. And so for this project, we were responding to this idea of separation, but we were looking very specifically at a model of separation by an economist called Thomas Schelling. And so Thomas Schelling's model of separation, which I think was called like the model of lightly biased segregation, explores this idea, a computational idea of how societies that contain only lightly biased individuals, and so by that I mean individuals who don't have like a kind of huge biases, like big kind of views on race and religion and these kind of things, but how even that itself can lead to extraordinarily segregated societies. And so this was a real landmark study in the 80s that also pushed forward zero player, like this idea of zero player games, or this kind of or these types of computational understandings of complex societal behaviors. But what we were really interested in is how we take that behavior and how we interrogate that kind of more computational and austere side of segregation. What does it feel like to be separated? What does it feel like to move around? What does it feel like and smell like and taste like and sound like to be part of that movement, to be part of diaspora? And so working within the foyer of the Haus der Kultur in the Welt, we used 1,000 recycled boxes, like vegetable crates, to create this mobile structure through which we tried to take the computational model off the grid. Within that structure, with a kind of dynamic performative space where we worked with a number of different groups within Berlin. This was a photographer and artist and a architect called Tiano Diallo, who we worked with, a group called, sorry, I forgot his group's name, Diallo. Is it called Diallo? Yeah, from Kreuzberg, and this really amazing Pan-African group that whose music kind of articulated the movement of the space throughout the installation. A fantastic, really inspirational group in Kreuzberg again. A group that empowered young North African girls through rap workshops, and so they kind of also performed in the space. And then and here's just some more things we're having fun in there. And so the working with a number of the different partners, the journey to the arrival of the space was a twofold one, by which we were working as much in the exploration of different groups and how we can work with these different groups in the activation of space, but also thinking about the demise of the space as well. It was a very strange project by which we had a really long period of time in the lead up to it and in the research and development of it, but the project only lasted for a very, very short period of time. And so we had to also think about what to do with the afterlife of that project and design its demise as well as designing its survival at the same time. What we ended up doing was connecting and mapping with a number of different organizations, from everything from urban farming organizations to all sorts within the city, to take these boxes once the installation had been taken down. And so what we ended up doing was connecting with a number of different organizations and really tapping into these different networks. It was really fantastic. So this was a group called Himmelbeat and Bedding, and they were an urban farming group that ended up taking a few boxes. And that's like some families from the peripheries of Berlin as well that took tons of the boxes. This was like a really crazy Portuguese guy who came in a big fire truck, and he ended up taking tons and tons of boxes. A really amazing free housing group in Kreuzberg called the Stadt von Unten, and they were in Kreuzberg Draguna. They were kind of trying to pioneer the free housing initiative with 1,000 to house 1,000 people. And the other day, I say the other day actually, but it's probably ages ago, like a year ago, we saw the boxes on their Instagram because they were using them as part of their kind of storage and stuff, and it was really interesting to see the different lives that these materials play, after the fact. Another project within the remit of separation is Common Thread, and Common Thread was a project that we worked on with the Science Gallery, specifically the young leaders in the Science Gallery, and which was a kind of a steering program of 16 to 25-year-olds. They were really concerned with this idea of anxiety as being a twofold phenomena. One being the neurological phenomena of anxiety, something that we experience, the very biological kind of neurological thing, and the other being the anxiety of a cultural phenomena. So this idea of cultural anxiety of diaspora losing their identity or gaining new identities after having moved or being part of these big kind of metropolitan or cosmopolitan centers. And so through a huge kind of a really long back and forth, we rested at this idea of the nexus of those two forms of anxiety very much being the physical, and this idea of the physical nexus being not only this idea that physical activity can assuage or can help us address different forms of anxiety, but that anxiety is a primarily physical phenomena, and that was to do with the neuroplasticity of the brain, and that all these emotions have a kind of physical effect on the way our brain is hardwired. And so that also came about from conversations and research that we had, it's conversations and discussions that we had with researchers at King's College as well. So the space, for the space, we ended up using. They were really interested in this idea of weaving as that physical activity, something that also mirrors the neuroplasticity of the brain. And we ended up using reconstituted yarn that we took from t-shirts from local charity shops in the areas, and creating these loom walls through which people could weave in and also weave out of the wall. And so the space kind of built up over time and over the different usages, and it was also publicly programmed with a number of different events. And so as it kind of changed over time, it recorded the movements, it recorded the reflections, and in some ways the anxieties of those who participated and moved through and used the space as well. And this was a photo from kind of towards the end of that space. The last one under separation was this idea of close from afar. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not entirely sure why I put it here, but it might become evident when I talk about it. So this is a project that we've recently finished for the London Design Festival in 2020, where we worked with students from the University of Greenwich on a project looking at this idea of the global as a collection of locals. We were really interested in this idea of how we've become proximate to things that are really, really far away, and how distances collapse within this frame of understanding locality and globalism as well. In kind of real terms, that was about looking at the immediate neighborhoods that surround the Now Gallery, where we're working in North Greenwich, working with local groups from those neighborhoods, but also exploring the global connections that these neighborhoods also have, from demographics, from kind of ethnic demographics to financial systems and all sorts. So we worked with a group of students from the University of Greenwich to create this kind of public space. And so this idea of site as a resource, which is something that I had alluded to at the start, was really embodied in this project, where we were working right behind the design district in Greenwich, and we used only waste materials that we could source from the site. So working really closely with Ardmore, who were the construction group for the design district, we ended up working in this really rhythmic way with the flows and excretions of the site, and that meant that we had to be really, really reactive, changing the designs every day, sometimes twice a day, to react to the kind of surplus of materials. A very interesting way of designing in a really iterative sense. And there's just some more things about having fun in the design. It's hard to think that we even were allowed to do this in these times, and so we ended up with a more landscaping approach of like designing this a kind of a network of different seating objects in this space, that then platformed 3 days and evenings of events, workshops, and kind of film screenings. All the this was from the opening, a group called Tomorrow's Warriors, who were really important, almost music infrastructure, kind of that get kids into jazz. Some of the kind of the bigger jazz names now, Nubia Garcia and this kind of thing, have all gone through Tomorrow's Warriors. It's really interesting group if anyone's interested in that kind of thing. And we had screenings and talks like this, and yeah, just a number of different things. So that was a really interesting project that I guess we're still kind of mulling over. Time, okay, 47. The Emotional Archival is the last collection of stuff I want to do, and I'll try and be discreet, although this is where Sheffield comes in, so I might rant. For this, we were really looking at emotions, and what we're really looking at is archival as something that's an active practice, the active practice of archiving our emotions and what role that plays within the built environment. This is a really fantastic quote by academic Zeynep Çelik, who's a Turkish academic who works a lot on kind of coloniality and post-colonial intersections in Algeria. I won't read it through because no, I won't read it through because if you're interested at the end, maybe I'll send it over. But it's really interesting about the role of memory and emotions in kind of physically constructing our realities. Other different kind of precedent projects like the anti-eviction mapping project in San Francisco, and also really heavily actually Kevin Lynch's mental mapping projects, especially with his work with the LA Department of Planning in '71, in the early '70s. And so this particular study, while he was at the planning department, was looking at people's perceptions of the kind of like what they felt like was their city in LA, and with 3 different demographics. So he used this mental mapping approach and aggregated them into these citizen images. He called it composite citizen images. On the left, he aggregated the citizen images of white American residents in Westwood, and there you can see really familiar and like common themes to LA, common kind of sites and locations that even we would kind of identify, having not, people who aren't in LA identify with: San Fernando Valley, Pacific Ocean, stuff like that, Long Beach. In the middle is African Americans in the neighborhood of Avalon, and still some remnants of those popular understandings, there's perhaps more global understandings, but a much smaller remit. And on the right, Latin Americans in Boyle Heights, and so even smaller, and to like a really like hyper-local scale. And so how different people see the same thing in a variety of really different ways was a really important part of the foundations of our project, The Garage, which we had at S1 in Park Hill in Sheffield in 2019. And so for this project, prior to actually doing anything or designing anything or thinking anything, we were really concerned, firstly, with getting to understand Sheffield, but trying to understand Sheffield through eyes that we could never really have, that we'd never have. We tried to understand it through the eyes of people who lived and worked and loved Sheffield. And so we developed and augmented this idea of mental mapping and took on an approach that we called emotional mapping. So we looked at the people's different emotional responses to the city and went on a series of mapping approaches. We were working throughout the project with 2 local secondary schools and the residence group, and Manor and Castle residence group. And so starting with the mapping exercises with those 2 groups, we were really looking at how people's different emotional responses to the city actually form this new geography of the city, this new emotional terrain of the built environment. And so we uncovered these really amazing and like fantastic examples of place, or like, forms of placemaking and perceptions of place as well, these contradictory perceptions of place. And it allowed us to have this insight into a city that I had never been to Sheffield prior to that, even though my mum grew up in Sheffield. And so like it was a really fantastic point about an insight into this place. So concerned now with this idea of how we kind of evince and archive people's different emotional responses to the city, but in a really performative and active way, we sought to then build a structure as part of the residency, a kind of internal structure that did this. And using the site of the resource again was a really important part of that. So it was in Park Hill. This is just a nice photo of Park Hill from the meadows. So we chose at this point to define site as a network rather than a confined geography. So we looked at a site as being the network of different artist centres and artist institutions within Sheffield, and use only waste materials from those different art galleries, block projects, etc., to construct this space. So we divided the space into 6 different sections, each section responding to this idea of how we can evince people's different emotional responses to the city. And and all the kind of projects, programming was a huge part of this project. So a huge onus on how we programmed the space and how we activated the space. And so we ended up creating curating a 2-month program of public events that kind of we were entangled with the different ways of archiving the city, or archiving people's emotional responses to the city. One section was this idea exploring the relationship between our bodies and public bodies, between the organ and organizations. And so we created a kind of structure through which a collecting structure through which people sat for talks and things, but were positioned just slightly more closely than you would otherwise like to be, slightly closer than space standards normally dictate, and as a way of making us feel viscerally this idea of the collective and the individual body. Mapping became a huge part of the space as well, and so the space got kind of dedicated to opening up that mapping process to also to all the participants and all the visitors of the space. We worked with some of the students on this idea of how we moved to the city, so created these polyurethane foam sculptures from this design exercise of capturing movement in the city, translating that into 2D sketches and then 3D objects, which we then kind of brought to life with the polyurethane foam. Narrating the city, so uncovering the stories that underpin Sheffield, and Sheffield really struck us as a city of stories, right? When you come to Sheffield, everyone will tell you the story of the industrialization, of football, of, there are these huge narratives that underpin Sheffield, but we were also really interested in the narratives that underpin those ones, narratives of ableism, narratives of race, of gender, of class, like how do those feed into the bigger stories within Sheffield. And that was really inspired by actually one of our mum's stories about her and her parents arriving to Sheffield, and something that I might maybe say in more detail at the time afterwards. Performance in the city was a huge part of this. So this was part of the installation where performances happened, and here we worked really closely with different performers in Sheffield. Otis Mensah was someone that we worked very, very closely with throughout the time, and kind of maintained a kind of really close connection with him. And part of the public programming of this point as well was to subvert the idea of the gallery space. And what we did for a week was to open up S1 Gallery to turn it not just into a performing space, but a rehearsal space, a space where musicians, performers, poets, whoever could jam in these spaces, and to really create that rift that I was talking about earlier before, how we create these rifts in the kind of normal operation of space and allow for a different type of access, to allow for like visions at least of a democratized access to space. And these are just more photos of like space in its action that people were doing their thing. These are Ubi Labs in Sheffield. If you haven't heard of Ubi Labs, definitely get in touch with them. They're a really amazing group. And yeah, so and also kind of a seating element that took precedence in there. So we're using old wall insulation to turn into mobile seats, so by people could explore the different connections or different ways of emotional archiving in that city as this continuous experience, rather than this piecemeal understanding of kind of, yeah, doing one thing and then another. What time is it now? Ooh, how much time do I have, guys? Someone signal me.
We'll carry on until people leave, I guess.
Okay. I mean, I could stop now if you guys want some questions.
No, I think we're all right for now.
Okay. Maybe I'll make this the last one, and then if you guys have some questions, maybe, because I don't want to just like disappear into the night. You know what I mean? Cool. So the last project I'll show, and I'll be quick, is Playing Pretend. This is the project that we did in Hull last year. So another really important way, like an important learning for us, more even than just a project, really learning and understanding the city of Hull and getting to know Hull in a really intimate way was a really fantastic opportunity for us. And so Playing Pretend was a kind of two-part project by which we developed a syllabus, a 5-part syllabus for 3 groups of school children between the ages of 6 and 8, and looked at this idea of how through play we can reimagine the city, and so how these reimaginations of the city from the kind of the actions and the ideas of young people also plays into these much wider conversations of city regeneration, conversations that are being had within kind of the built environment profession as well. So really trying to tie those worlds together. Programming again was a huge part of this, and in this sense, much less about this performative type of programming, like inviting people in to do things in space, but rather about how we negotiate between these really varied senses of time. The kind of time and the logistics behind 6 to 8-year-olds is so vastly different between the time and the logistics of adults and professionals, and kind of marrying those two times was really a really interesting exercise that I think is also inherently spatial. So the workshops took a number of different forms. We did lots of looking at different precedents and kind of more sitting down workshops, but also tons and tons of being outside. So throughout the 5 days of workshopping, we also led them on like a number of different like tours around town and kind of explored the front and back of these different functions and buildings in the city and shops within the city, really hands-on as well. So lots of making. And lots of onus on like how we make and think design through making kind of iterative working. Public health and exploring public health in the city from the perspective of 6 to 8 years was a huge part of this as well, and done interactively as other aspects of the project were done as well. And also making, so making as a form of understanding our city, making as a form of thinking through design, and the built environment was also a really important part of the project too. We worked with a sound designer called Dan Jones, and so throughout the exercise and throughout the syllabus, we also were recording the voices and discussions of the children, which turned into a kind of soundscape piece, which at the culmination of the project, which was the Meanwhile space on the High Street in Hull Town Centre, and that was then projected out onto into the street, so it became part of the kind of public realm. The Meanwhile space sought to kind of bring together the learnings and the processes of the workshops, but to open those out to children from across the city. So to really bring those processes into a central space, and then to kind of change the nature of access to them so that anyone can access these spaces. So each element of the space reflected some part of the workshops, and here's just some of the space in use. We working with the site as a resource again. We ended up using tons and tons of recycled local materials from like kind of nearby factories to like waste from leftovers and waste from shops, and we're able to kind of complete the project in a really, really, really small budget. And so like, yeah, just different elements of how we were working the learnings from the young participants into kind of the physical scheme of the space. And I'll end there and not go on the other two ones because I don't want to take up too much time. And I'd like you guys to ask questions if you have them.
Thank you very much for that, Akil. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, if they want to either just pipe up or put a question in the chat box. But for now, whilst we're waiting for, I'm saying we've got any immediate ones. Seeing you had a project at Park Hill, what are your thoughts on the sort of regeneration of Park Hill?
Yeah, good question. I think it's Park Hill is a really it's quite contentious in many ways, but it's it's also more straightforward in others. And I think some of the conversations around Park Hill, I think we came with a very London-centric view, and I think there are some elements of what's happening at Park Hill that are quite straightforward in terms of like how Urban Splash have approached, especially the development of the next 2 blocks. But others are less straightforward, and I think Park Hill as a space, as a physical space, is one thing, but also as a mnemonic space is another. And the kind of stories, the perceptions that local people have of Park Hill was really shocking to me. I was extremely shocked to think. I came in thinking Park Hill, this really beautiful vestige of utopianist critical urban theory, manifest as part of the social housing program in the 60s and whatever, and came and heard nothing but bad things about it from people in the local area. Anyone in Manor and Castle had anything, unless they were from Park Hill, any perception was like the most negative thing I've ever heard. Exaggeratedly so. Like there's lots of all these different stories, which were very fun for me to hear. But I think what it just communicated to me that this is a really complicated project, and that anything on that scale, especially on the kind of also the mythological scale of Park Hill, is something necessarily complicated. It's like, and for that reason, I have a view of Urban Splash. I'm not particularly fond of Urban Splash, but I do think that Park Hill as a development is slightly more complicated than good and bad. That wasn't like the most refined answer, but I don't want to rant on about.
It's easily done. I think Polly seems to be saying she's got a question if she wants to come to the floor, as it were.
Hello.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay from this far?
Yeah.
Nice to see you again, Akil, Poly 3.09.
Hey, how's it going?
Right. Yeah, good, thanks. Yeah, really good. Really good lecture. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
It's a little bit of a dry one from me, but I guess we both know as well as each other how quite like community-based and participatory architecture can be a labor of love and not always have very much money involved in it. And obviously, you know, there's funding and things, and I'm not exactly directly asking you like how you fund things, but I'm just wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about how you balance that kind of you know, passion versus like economical business model.
How we pay the bills, how we keep the lights on. Well, I think it's a mixture of things, and like, so again, I'll try and be as concise as possible. But the first thing is that, and this is kind of goes for any young creative organization, is that like I think when we took a lot of inspiration, although the type of inspiration we now take from some of these organizations is a bit more contested. But at the start, we took a lot of inspiration from the work of practices like Assemble, the decorators, etc. And not just in what they were doing, because they were this first wave of architects that were using temporary interventions and kind of reappraising the idea of temporary interventions as being very much part of the architectural canon. And they were doing this, but they were doing this on the fly, right? And they all had these free spaces they were operating out of, these old abandoned spaces, very much like a kind of squatting practice. And so like stories of like how Public Works had their place for 5 years for free, and how like Assemble had their little studio, whatever it was called, for free, etc., was like really inspirational for us. So we were like, right, okay, we can do the same thing. We'll just get somewhere for free. And that's what we did. And that's what we can kind of continue to do. And although it seems really menial, actually, there's no way these small creative practices would survive if they all had to go to WeWork and pay £200 a month to be in a space. It doesn't make any sense. Like if we had to pay £1 a month in the first year, we'd be in a negative of £12. You know what I'm saying? So like, it actually like it really takes it really took a smart approach to how we started and boosted off in that sense, and we're kind of smart about our overheads, and then we could start to be more formal about some of those things. So that's on a kind of really internal sense. I think like securing your own, like you know, creating as fertile a grounds for you to start is really, really important. And so don't take that one lightly at all. Onto the thing about like onto really the financial model. A lot of our work is like threefold at the moment. I'd say the third of it comes from working with local authorities. So some of the work that I didn't show is work that we do with local authorities and more kind of community engagement and resilience building approach. And that's often working on kind of master planning projects, whereby which we're kind of working in a kind of participatory or co-design way with local people, either kind of evincing the principles of a master plan or kind of working directly on the design of something. That is something that is continuous in some way, and like is a steady stream of money for people who want to engage in that. And I think there are lots of practices that have now turned their attention to just a community engaging type approach to architecture, which I think is, you know, it's fine, but not something that we necessarily want to do. Like I really hate, in fact, being called like a community engagement expert. I don't think it makes any sense. The second third is the installations. Those very rarely make lots of money, but you can like carve some money out for yourselves if you kind of work in a smart way about them. And those are more ad hoc, but those again they do pop up quite a lot. And then the very last one is one that we've more recently worked into, which is a more kind of design research approach. So we've been working quite closely with V&A East recently, and also with the Het Nieuw Institute in Rotterdam. And they all tie into one another. So it's all really about like situated practices and working very closely with local people. It's very little to do with being in the V&A. But that is more long-term work, and the rhythms of that are much slower, but it's also more constant. And then also teaching, and also we've started teaching as well. So like, there's no one way that we've been balancing the books. It's always a bit of a hot potato type thing. And I imagine that's just what it'll be for, you know, until I die. But, yeah.
Thanks very much.
No worries.
We've got another question from Sebastian, and that asks, does the legacy of the temporary projects kind of exist in discourse, particularly within formal institutions like councils, but also within the communities? And is this the aim of projects or a byproduct in any way?
Does it exist in discourse? Explain what you mean by in discourse.
Sebastian, are you here?
Yeah, I kind of, I mean, almost like as an idea that is continued through the community. So especially on the first section of the lecture, you kind of talked about how you helped out another practice kind of do something similar to what you did on the same project. And that's kind of what I mean, like it's continued
Right.
in that sense.
Yeah. Good. Fantastic question. I think it does. I think it's like, in that respect, yes. And 3.09 probably will tell you that was a huge struggle. The council was not being kind of cooperative with them when it turned to doing their one, and also hadn't been with the people that we'd worked with before with Farouk. And so they ended up having to do it not in Brixton but somewhere else. But it does. In some ways, we try and let that legacy exist in the way of like pushing other practitioners to do a similar thing and to work with other practitioners to enable them to do these similar things. That's something that's really important to us. And more recently, for example, so we've been working with, we made that Croydon Council, and we've designed this digital platform that kind of gathers people's memories. I meant to show it in the thing, but ran out of time. It kind of gathers people's memories and emotions of spaces within the Pearly Way in Croydon. And that's something that we kind of made from the ground up. We coded the whole thing, but something that we've just shared out. And like, actually, I'm actively trying to get more and more people to take the code and to do more things with it and to develop it and to do whatever, because like that's actually how these projects live and exist. They're not intellectual property. They're provocations for people to do more things. I think as well, I would like them to do, I hope that they do in some ways, is also convince people that they can do a similar thing, that even if you're not practitioners, or that you can take, wherever it is that you do, that you go on to then do that. And so like that, and that's one of the reasons why we're trying to work quite simply into some ways. Like we work with really simple materials often and don't do things that require crazy amounts of resource. But also like, to work in a way to inspire people to continue doing more, and because we are so inspired by the people that come to our spaces and the people that we work with, to really share in that, and to go out in that. Like one of the, I had this moment last year with this person who, with a group of her friends, has created this zine called Sauti. It's this really amazing zine that documents the experience of East African diaspora. And had these really amazing like tripartite launch in here in Zanzibar and in Khartoum in Sudan, and it was just a really fantastic project. And when she was talking to me about it, she was like, "You don't remember me?" Halfway through the conversation, she was like, "You don't remember me, do you?" I was like, "No." And she was like, "The first time I performed within Verbal Space was the first time I ever, did any kind of spoken poetry." And I'm not taking credit for her being an amazing poet and person now, of course not. But I think like that's what I mean by giving these riffs and these platforms. Like we were inspired in a similar way as younger people and as students by projects that we were allowed into, and we kind of saw a way of doing things ourselves. And so the idea is to, at the very, very, very least, if we're not able to affect policy and we're not able to affect wider systems of subjugation, then at least we're able to encourage people to think that they can do a similar thing themselves.
Okay, thank you. That's a really interesting way of kind of trying to benefit things beyond just the formal institutions.
Thank you.
I think we've got a question from Mimi next.
Hi. I've got literally a ton of questions, but I'm going to try and focus them.
I've got a question for you, Mimi. Are you related to someone called Gabriel Barr?
Yeah, he's my brother.
Yeah. I used to play football with him in Cease and UCL.
Really? Oh,
Yeah.
him. I spotted that you'd worked with Eyesore. I wrote a
Yeah, Armin.
Yeah.
My dog.
Yeah. Yeah, what's this, little sis? So yeah, I was about to say I've got like a ton of questions that I could ask you, but I'm going to try and focus on one which hopefully addresses more of the year as a whole. And I think, you know, a bit about Sheffield as a university, we work quite a lot with participatory practice and like working with communities. And I think now, given our current situation, it's a lot harder to infiltrate into those communities and like have that grounding and local understanding. So previously in last year, we would go on site and we could talk to local communities and try and engage with them that way. I think, for example, our studio is based in Thamesmead, for example, which again, they've got Peabody running it as a whole. So I think one question I guess I could ask you is how, as a cohort of students trying to make local specific community design, how can we do that given the current context? And as a subsidiary question, I was also noticed that you're part of the Participatory City trustees.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that as well. So sorry, lots of information there.
Sure. Yeah. So the first one, the blunt answer is I really have no idea, and it's something that we've also struggled with. I think the only thing, and you know, I've been talking about this earlier today, that I would say is that like remote work doesn't necessarily always mean digital work, and like actually like we've been in a position in this country where even in the kind of the rapture of lockdown, we were never, you know, banned from being in physical spaces. That we were never like stopped from really being in somewhere physical, like, you know, being outside in somewhere physical. And so there's still an element of kind of deep hanging out. There's still an element of like a priori understanding. I mean, like being in the space and understanding through experience. That can be beneficial to our spatial practices when we're working with communities. So even if we're not allowed to talk to people, even if we're not allowed to do whatever, being somewhere for really, really long periods of time, hanging out in places, is a really important anthropological method to like any architecture practice when it comes to working with communities. And I think that's still something that's available to us. And unless we're actually confined to our houses, that's still something that will continue to be available to us. It might mean that we have to change the remit of the object of our desires to our immediate local areas instead of kind of getting the train from Sheffield down to Thamesmead. But you know, it also focuses you to reevaluate the spaces. And I think, like, you know, I'm saying this through personal bias, but you know, if I was a student stuck in Sheffield, that would be the dream for me. You know, you could pick any neighborhood in Sheffield, and like, you know, you could be there for a million years and continue to discover these like hidden gems and these things. It really is the kind of place that gives and giving. But I know it's not a fantastically satisfactory answer, and it's something that we've had to push lots of things online when it comes to that side. And this year, we've become familiar, like more native to lots of different digital ways of working. And it has its pros, but like I also don't think it will in any way supplant working physically, because you'll never have that intimacy. It won't replace that intimacy. It won't replace the meaningfulness of your connection with someone when you work haptically or you work in the same space. But it can build a platform to do more work like that afterwards. And I think we're personally in like a very, I don't know, it's a strange position because we've moved studio now, so we're in Custom House in East London, and we're in an abandoned shop. So we're on this old high road, an abandoned shop. And even though we're in the midst of COVID, we end up speaking to people all the time because people will always just come in and pass and like say hi and whatever. So like there are these banal kind of interactions which are like beneath the threshold of what's allowed. They're beneath a certain threshold of visibility anyway. And I think it's really about, we have to focus that sometimes. I guess we have to take a step back during this time and focus our practice on those more subtle and like intimate moments and try and derive what we can from those until we're allowed to do big workshops and do stuff like that again. On the Participatory City thing, so Participatory City is a really fantastic initiative that I encourage all of you guys to go and look at. And it's just really, I mean, I kind of fell in love with it the first time I went down there. It's embarking in Far East London. And it was funded by the GLA and a bunch of other different kind of funders. And they are essentially, it's like a network of like community organizations. It started as these community shops. So these shops by which people could come in, and there was a kind of a cooperative governance model through which people would come in and then work within the shop, and it took on all these various forms as a result of the kind of collaborative and participatory nature of these places. It kind of balances this upskilling with also this valuing of local knowledge as well. So really important two things there. They then built this huge makerspace on Barking Riverside that exists in this massive warehouse. And when you think makerspace, you kind of think like, oh, gentrification. And you know, gentrification as an objective thing definitely ties into this, because the land is now more valuable than it was when it was nothing. However, like, I think when I went there, I was like, I completely fell in love with it. I remember there were these kids who I thought were lost. I thought these kids were lost on their way to playing football or something. They had like the Adidas tracksuits on, and they looked like they were too cool for school, and they're there like with a football in hand. So I was thinking like, what are these kids doing here? But they were actually using CNC machines. So the kids, they were there like using the CNC machines, and they were being taught beekeeping as well and stuff. And it was just like, it was my utopian vision. And I got really sad, because I was like, where I'm from, we need something like this where I'm from. We need something like this in all our neighborhoods in London. And so I kind of joined the trustee team to help them think of a more urban approach and adjust to a more urban strategy, because they have lots of designers, like product designers and these kind of things, people who are focused on making in there. But I think what they're really interested in as well is like a more integrated urban approach to how they do this work. Is that okay?
Thanks. Yeah, I've got a lot of energy to read a lot more about it, and I think it will probably be quite a good stepping point for at least my project, but probably quite a few other people's projects as well, given the situation and nature of things.
Definitely. They have there's this huge report, I think it's called Tomorrow's Streets or something. I can't remember the name of the report is, but it's massive, and definitely worth reading. It's a big PDF report, and it's definitely worth reading for everyone. So yeah.
Cheers. Thank you.
Nice.
I'll open the table for someone else.
Has anyone got any other questions?
Even like really like blunt, silly questions, I'm like happy to answer. Like when I wish I asked more students when I was I wish I asked more questions when I was a student. I didn't, and I now don't have the answers. That's what no one tells you. If you don't ask them now, you'll never know the answer ever.
Quick one from me again. You mentioned about joy early on in your talk. How do you sort of see spreading joy over these sort of? So you probably touched on it a little bit in the last answer actually, but spreading joy over like Zoom calls and stuff. How do you find that?
Spreading joy.
Particularly when everyone's faces are hidden as well.
Yeah, I know, right? With all, like, it's great. But I'm wondering whether it's worse, but everyone's faces being hidden, or like for my students, sometimes it's really early when we do our tutorials, and like sometimes in the group tutorial, some of them are like falling asleep on the camera. I wonder if it's worse, people falling asleep on camera or people not showing their face. But I think, like, yeah, it's difficult. I mean, like, so I also work part-time as a researcher at LSE, and we're doing this project exploring like the impact of privatized public spaces on young people in Brent. And we're working with a collection of young people from Brent, and we've employed them as local researchers for the LSE, and we've kind of worked with them on this over a course of a few months during the lockdown. And that's been really challenging, because a lot of them we had already worked with last year, and we're working with them in a different capacity this year. But we're having it's the Zoom thing. Like, they're all like 16, 17. They don't want to show their faces, red hair. And like, it's really difficult. It's just so far removed from what we were doing last time, where we were really together and we were having this kind of collective haptic. I keep using the word haptic, but you know what I mean? Like this collective experience that was, really about bodies in space. It was an architectural experience at its fundamental kind of sinews. And I think through the Zoom thing, my honest approach is to crack enough jokes to keep people interested in what's going on. Like I really don't think that like a lot of the being in space with the kids last year was also about confidence building. And in order to build people's confidence, in order so that they can participate actively and confidently in these types of dialogues, which are quite complicated. We're going through some really complicated and quite overwhelming things. You have to keep a kind of lightheartedness to it. It's the same kind of, it's the same lightheartedness we try and employ in our practice too. Like if you came into the studio at any given point, like chances are we're probably busting jokes, right? Like it's not going to seem like the most serious affair in the world. But I think that's also just it's a really important part to how you work professionally, and it's also a very important part to how you practice as well, you know, spatially.
I think that sort of idea of humour as well is quite sort of, it makes it more accessible to a lot of people, I guess, because there is a sort of pretentiousness that goes around architecture and a lot of creative industries on the whole.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, unnecessarily so, and also like almost ahistoric. Well, I don't want to give my contentious views on architecture history, but you know what I mean. It's like there are tons of contemporary practices that use humor in an extremely explicitly architectural way. You know, fat architects aren't around anymore, but fat architects are a fantastic example of that. Adam Nathaniel Furman, etc., etc. Like the list goes on. And historically, you know, like you could open up any like classic architectural textbook, like Adrian Forty, anything like that. You know, like and you periodically encounter times at which the architectural profession, the built environment, in the more general sense, looked back or looked forward into things using humor. Humor and joy are really important parts of you know, how we perform our cities. So yeah, I think we shouldn't be too extreme from it. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be serious about what you're doing, right? It doesn't mean that like you know, you decide not to finish your work and to go to bed at 10 o'clock when you really should be staying up all night. Like, but it also, you have a laugh about it, you know what I mean? Like, go have fun after.
We've got one more question actually. How did you start off to get where you are, and any tips for architecture students in traditional architectural education institutions?
So how do we start off? So we started off by pestering the London Design Festival, because they kind of operate in groups, I guess, and like local groups. And so the bit in Brixton were having their bit, and so we pestered them. We kept pestering them, so can we do this? And after a while, they said, yeah, you can do it, but they can't have any money for it. And so we went about trying to find money for it, and then we got money from our university, but also lots of money from local organizations. And we ended up doing that. And at the time, we didn't start with a view to doing anything else other than that one project, and things snowballed in that way. So I think as much as, like, you know, it's kind of sexy to go and do business plans these days from the get off, like as soon as you leave school as 21, like you go and you get your Excel spreadsheet, but it's like, I think, as you know, that's fine, but like also that first opportunity will be a snowball effect, so whatever you're doing. And so, like, really, especially as a student, the first thing I do is pave that way to the first opportunity. So like during your summers, make sure that you're kind of volunteering with different organizations. There's so much amazing thing that's going, so many amazing things going on all the way around the world. Even Sheffield, like Sheffield Food Hall are a fantastic organization that do tons of stuff with architecture, and also like more kind of social value programming. They're a fantastic group to volunteer with when you have some time, and that paves your way towards that first opportunity when you want to do something yourself, and you kind of already seen it being done, and you already have these networks, and you've already done that. That's a really traditional answer to that question. Sorry about that. And then the tips for the thing, I think it would be the same tip. It'd be that tip about going off and doing and finding all those things. Also, don't like I'm going to be controversial. Nah, actually, no, don't. Just do the first thing. I think just do the first thing I said.
Thank you.
No worries.
I think we've got another question from Polly, but I think after that we might wrap things up.
Okay.
Oh, I don't want to hold the mic if there's another question going. Like if it's one question left, I'm more than happy to hold back. Just Akil seems pretty up for answering them, which is wicked. So. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about your approach to kind of contacting local groups and communities. Just for a bit of context, the studio that I'm in, we're focusing, like our theme is process, so we're focusing solely on how we get to where we want to be. And my themes in particular are quite sensitive topics. So I guess my question is, I mean, I'm all for just being like super positive, and as long as you're trying to do something positive and you're approaching it with like respect and manners, then you know that's a pretty good baseline. But I was wondering if you had any sort of specific approaches that you take in terms of like field research and contacting groups. Yeah.
It's a really difficult one, especially as a student as well, because I think there's a growing understanding of the kind of short-termism of student projects. and that like a student involvement is necessarily tied to the rhythms of an academic year. And so like you might be there one time and like your involvement's very intense, but it's also intense because you're on a different kind of clock to whoever's working in this group. And so sometimes I feel like that can be quite a hard thing to navigate. I think the only thing really is that is to think of as trust building exercises as something that's longitudinal. It's something, even if you do get an in from the start, really building a kind of a meaningful and trusting relationship with local partners is something that takes a really long time. So always just with an understanding to that, and like to know that you are a student, so you do have these short time frames. It's just about negotiating those things, and that's not to say like I think there are some fantastic there are tons of fantastic examples of projects that have come directly out of student involvement in local communities, right? So like Loughborough Junction Farm is something that's really quite a place that's really dear to my heart, and that was done when Tom from Public Works, because he lived in Loughborough Junction, he started to take an interest in that, and so he worked there. He also did a lot of stuff there like over his weekends and like completely outside of school. But yeah, I think it is a very, very difficult one. But like your approach about positivity is number one. To be positive and to be genuinely helpful and to be genuinely well-meaning is one thing. And then the second is just an eye to the longevity of this kind of thing. If there's some way in which longevity can be assured, if there's a more coordinated approach by the whole unit, let's say, or by the university, some way of kind of working with a group that's sensitive, because it is detrimental sometimes if what you do is kind of fly in, leave some wacky thing, and then fly out. It's no one wants that. But like, yeah, I think but it's a difficult one. Sorry, I mean, I don't know how the question wasn't answered very well. You can see it's something that I'm really working with as well. But yeah.
Cool, nice one. Thanks very much.
No worries. Cool. So there we go then. If anyone else has any like questions, John can send you my email, and then I'm happy to email answer those questions as well.
Yeah, I'll send that through to people. But yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for a really interesting and quite inspiring talk, actually.
Thank you for having me, guys, and take care.
Yeah, hopefully we can get you up in Sheffield, maybe towards live projects.
Soon, man. I was trying to come to Sheffield like the other day, man. I got time blocked by the tier 2 business. But yeah, for sure. Sooner than later.
That'd be great.
All
Great,
right.
thank you very much.
Take care, guys.
You too. Thank you.
Nice one.